Geek. Talking baseball every week. Cause they're Gleeman and the Geek.
And welcome to Gleeman and the Geek, the So Long Luis edition. I am John Bonus from TwizDaily.com. With me, Aaron Gleeman of The Athletic.
You almost forgot who I was. How about the Hello Pablo edition?
Could say Hello Pablo, but I don't think that was the focus of most of the coverage of this.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
Even your story was framing it. Framing the acquisition of Pablo Lopez around the departure of Luis Arraez, the press conference that we sat in with Pablo Lopez and Derek Falvey. The first two questions were about losing Luis Arraez.
Yes.
Right?
Although that's not uncommon. I mean,
no, it's not.
The departing player always gets a... Because here's the thing. We're not going to be talking... Sadly, we're not going to be talking about Luis Arraez that much anymore.
Well, sure. No, listen, by all means, right.
This might be one of the last times Derek Falvey has a chance to talk at length about Luis Arraez. But, I mean, just in general, this wasn't it certainly wasn't a shocking trade.
No.
I mean, Luis Arraez, I went back and looked. I mean, we've credited Dan Hayes way, way too much on this show for my taste, but he just continues to do a really good job, so it pains me to give him compliments. But I went back and looked December 5th. So that was before I had even arrived in San Diego for the winter meetings. He wrote an article, and the headline was basically Twins are considering shopping Luis Arraez for pitching help. And that caused quite a stir. On Twins Twitter and on message boards and in the comments. And I will tell you now that Luis Arraez is on another team. At the winter meetings themselves, there were a few calls that came through to the Twins and to Dan from agents and whoever. Dan was 100% on the money with that. And beyond that, Pablo Lopez, more specifically, has been linked to the Twins for 3 months now. And even I went back and looked because I was like, I think I've written about Pablo Lopez. I wrote about him last offseason as like here's a relatively young team-controlled pitcher the Twins could get. And then I wrote about him in July, along with like Tyler Mahle. Here are some trade deadline starters, and they ended up getting Tyler Mahle. And then Falvey said like you said, we did a Zoom press conference with him and Pablo Lopez right after the trade, whichever day that was. And Falvey said, we've been trying to trade for him for like 4 years since he was like not even established
Several
in the
years,
majors.
Right, yes. And we've watched him get better and better.
Right. Yeah, the cost keeps going up, unfortunately. So it's certainly not a shock in that. I mean, I think also just bigger picture, the idea of the Twins trading a left-handed hitter for pitching help is something that we've just hammered, ad nauseum for the past X number of weeks.
We thought it was going to be Kepler originally.
Yeah, but
Arraez has been the second most talked about name.
In part, by the way, just because he's good.
Right.
I mean,
yes. That's what turns out in order to trade somebody.
Right.
You have to have the sweet spot. And the sweet spot is you have to be somewhat expendable from your team, and they have to be good enough that other teams want them. Right.
So I also think this trade was, like you kind of hinted at the beginning, destined to be unpopular among a large segment of the fan base, almost no matter what the trade itself was. Like, short of them trading Luis Arraez for, I don't even know, who's really good, Juan Soto.
Okay.
Or something.
Sure.
Not even, because he's an impending free agent. Right. Who's really good, John? Who do we like on another team?
How about Mike Trout?
Yeah, but he's old and expensive now. Anyway, short of trading him for some, Babe Ruth in his prime, basically. This was going to be unpopular, in part because Luis Arraez is super popular.
Right.
He's lovable. He's beloved. He's well-liked as a player, as a personality, as a kind of stylistic lighthouse that people can point to and say, see, batting average still matters. Old school still matters. Not striking out still matters. He kind of scratches every itch for a certain segment of the fan base. And I love watching Luis Arraez. We've been effusive of praise over him since 2019 when he came up and debuted. I mean, he's never not hit. He hit in the minors. He hit as soon as they called him up in 2019 to the point that he pushed Jonathan Scope out of the second base job in the second half. He's hit and hit and hit 314, I think, for his career now in almost 400 games spread over 4 seasons.
Right.
Last year he hit 316 and he won his first batting title. He strikes out less than anybody in baseball.
As we pointed out on the Patreon, he's also just one of those guys that you kind of look to find out where he is in the lineup every inning. Like, how far are we from Arraez? Like, I know I'm going to get a really quality. You just feel like he's one of the top 3 or 4 guys, one of those guys you want to see coming up because you know that's going to be a good quality at bat. And I'll add something. You mentioned the batting championship. I think part of it, the longer you have followed the Twins, which is, the old guy thing, right? Because we've had, Tony Leave a batting champion, Rod Carew batting champion.
They've had an incredible number of batting champions. Right. Joe Mauer, right, et cetera, right? Like, batting champions is something we can get excited about. Like, that is a Minnesota fan thing. We feel like, oh yeah, and especially when you've got a batting champion that looks like Rod Carew, like his at bats feel like Rod Carew's at bats, especially to the 50 and older crowd, like I am, right? Losing a batting champion so many years as a Twins fan, we have celebrated, hey, we've got the batting champion, that when you get rid of a batting champion, it's hard to say, that didn't matter that much.
Exactly.
No, you're right.
There's an investment in batting champions around this area that I think also plays into it.
Also, did you see the tidbit that the last time a reigning batting champion was traded was Rod Carew?
I was going to guess it's got to be Rod Carew, right?
78 or something like that? I don't remember what it was.
After the lumber company year.
Right. They traded him to the Angels.
Yep.
So, you go, this is going to be Rod Carew all over again. Well, Luis Arraez is a really good hitter and a really fun. He ain't Rod Carew, but he's really good. Right. I think, it's difficult to say. I think also people have a hard time, like when we say batting average is overrated. I think that is undeniable at this point in baseball history. Although it's become so true for so long that it's almost like
so we're almost seeing the pendulum swing back a little
bit, maybe. Right. But also just this notion of how can they trade the batting champion? Well, I mean, look, would it be different if he had 3 fewer hits last year and he would have finished second?
Yeah, that is kind of my point, though. If he was a second place in the batting champion, there would not be as much outrage.
I agree.
We have something invested in our hearts for batting champions.
And reading the comments and tweets and stuff, people are still so focused on batting average, and I get it. And it's something we talked about with Mauer when he used to bat in front of Justin Morneau, which is the years that Morneau either won MVP or was runner-up for any MVP. Statistically, if you're looking at, wins above replacement or stuff like that, Mauer was always as good or better, but people would look at the RBI totals of Justin Morneau because at that point, 10, 15 years ago, RBIs were a little bit leaving fashion, but they were still prominent. When a guy drove in 130 runs and the other guy drove in 74 runs or whatever, it's, this guy was more valuable. Right. In reality, the RBIs for Morneau were tied to the on-base skills for Mauer. And one of the things I remember often writing and saying back then was Mauer does a million little things that help you. And sometimes it's just stuff that's not even seen, which is the ability to play his type of bat at catcher leaves open first base and DH for a type of bat like Morneau. Well, there's value Mauer provides, but it's not even really apparent. Then you have all the defensive stuff, like the fact that he was just a Gold Glove winning catcher. But what I really meant was Mauer hit a million singles and drew walks and did all that stuff. And then Morneau would come up and rip a 2-run homer or whatever. And you go, wow,
or a double off the wall.
Morneau really changed the game. Well, yeah, his big things are easier to notice than the more frequent but smaller things that Mauer did. And so in a weird way, though, I think we've almost gotten away from that, which is Luis Arraez does a million little things. And what I mean by that, I don't even mean he's not a good defender, but I think he's a pretty good base runner. But I don't even mean it in the Mauer way. What I mean is he just hits singles. And it's there a higher percentage of his at-bats end in someone going, man, he's a good hitter.
Right. Yeah,
whereas the overall production isn't necessarily higher than someone who hits 275 and hits 30 homers instead of 5 homers and draws more walks or strikes out more or whatever. But there is a sense, it's almost like eating junk food. He's got little bites all over the house. This is my problem at home. There's a little bag of chips here. There's a Starburst here that you can constantly feel like you're you're taking in calories with Luis Arraez. You know what I mean? You're never starving with Luis Arraez.
Wow.
He often gets at least one hit every game. Like you said, he's a great at bat. He doesn't give away at bats.
Right.
And if you watch him for 100 at bats, which is 30 games or something like that, you're going to end up coming away from it and going, yeah, like 32% of the time or something like that, he got a hit. Like it's really good. And the difference is though, so you go, how can you trade a guy like that? But the issue is he's doing all those little things. But then if you zoom back a little bit, or zoom out a little bit, excuse me, and you look and you go, okay, he did all the little things better than everyone else. But he had a 795 OPS because those little things can get dwarfed by someone capable of doing big things. And what I mean is, if you look at him among first basemen and DHs, which is what he primarily played in the second half of last year, which is we're going to talk about that in a second too. I think he had 795 OPS, which is good, solid. He had 130 OPS plus, which means he was like 30% better than an average hitter. But the problem is his career OPS, I think, is 784, which again is good.
Right. Yeah.
The average first baseman during his career from 2019 to now, the average first baseman has a 780 OPS, which means he's been average. Now he's a little bit on base heavy on that, which has more value than slugging.
Exactly right.
So he's been a slightly above average first baseman, but no one who's upset about this trade has that perception of him. First of all, a lot of people still are thinking of him as a second baseman.
Yeah, and
which is he's going to play second.
He's going to be playing second there,
Marlins.
and I mean, if the Twins had an opening at second base, they might not be as anxious to trade away Luis Arraez. They might,
but they had an opening at second base in the second half last year when Polanco missed like 6 weeks, and
true.
Nick Gordon played second base and Arraez played first base or DH. I just think,
they also didn't really have anybody to plug in at first base last year.
Well, that was true too. True.
They were just so banged up it didn't matter.
But I mean, we saw this. I want to say gradually, but it wasn't that gradual. I mean, Arraez was playing third base early on this past season. He didn't start a game at third after April because it looked so bad there. 2 years ago, they tried to get his bat in the lineup in left field, 20 games or something like that. And it didn't work defensively. And also they felt like it was bad for his knees. He's a guy who, when he first came up and he was, 22, he was, stretched at second, but a capable second baseman. But, I mean, he's only 25 now, but he's got like a 60-year-old's legs. Right. And I say that as someone who's 40 and has 100-year-old's legs. But, I mean, he's had so many knee problems and last year hamstring problems. And also just from a tool standpoint, I mean, he just doesn't have that much range. His arm is a little bit scattershot. I think I will be, put it this way, I will be surprised if the Marlins stick with him for, 100-plus games at second base. But we'll see. It's almost irrelevant to the Twins side because the Twins were just never going to be in a spot where they viewed him as a viable regular at second. In part, because they have Jorge Polanco there right now for the next 2 years at least.
We hope.
Who's I mean, Polanco is a good example of what I'm talking about, which is Polanco hits 260 or 270 most years, but his OPS is not really any different than Luis Arraez. It just the path to get there is more aesthetically pleasing for a guy who hits most batting, is mostly batting average. And it's hard to get around that because it's just a higher percentage of their at-bats end in hits. And that is sort of a dopamine hit to somebody who's watching. And you go, oh, Luis Arraez did something good there. Well, if he does something quote-unquote good 32% of the time and Jorge Polanco only does it 26% of the time, you can do the math there on why people might be coming away from it. But I think that's key. Like the defensive stuff and the health of Arraez, I think, did play a big part in this because from the Twins' standpoint, they had ruled out third base for him. They had ruled out left field or right field for him. Second base, I think if they wouldn't have made this trade, he would have been, third or fourth in line at second base. He might have gotten a start or two there as an emergency guy or whatever. But they just weren't going to play him at second base. And they also have a million young guys, Royce Lewis, Brooks Lee, Edward Julian, in addition to Polanco and Gordon and on and on.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about Julian on this on the free side of this podcast. It is something we've talked a little bit more on the Patreon, which we should just give a quick, short plug to.
Yes, we did a immediate reaction to the Arraez trade, like immediate. Right. We came right off the Zoom call with Derek Falvey, and I headed over here.
1 hour and a half, I think. maybe an hour and a half, close to well over an hour of Arraez / Lopez / prospects talk. Immediate, like the trade went down Friday afternoon, and we had it out there Friday night, and people were listening to it Friday night and Saturday morning.
So that's a more in depth. We'll get into a lot of that here, but it was a super in depth focused on that. We also just did an interview with Phil Miller that was like 2 hours long. That was really great. And before that, we did one with Dan Hayes that I think people really love too. So, and
I think this week we'll probably be doing a mailbag, right?
Yeah,
don't you think? We have probably a Lopez Arraez mailbag,
a lot of questions,
and a Twins Fest maybe.
Yeah, that's right. So,
and in fact, we'll also just to lay out the next week or two. Next week, you'll be getting a free podcast, but what it will supposedly be, we'll see if it works out, is the Winter Meltdown. We'll be recording the Winter Meltdown, which are going to be interviews with Patrick Royce and Glenn Perkins, and then we'll get back to like the regular show 2 weeks, maybe a week from Friday. We'll do just before we head to Spring before at least I am heading to Fort Myers.
What day?
I think the 14th is when I'm heading. I think I'm heading on Valentine's Day.
Romantic. By yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't worry, buddy. I'll be there 4 days later to romance it up with her.
She'll be there 3 days later. So
she is going.
Okay.
I take it back. I won't romance it up with you then.
No, you will not.
That's her job. Yeah. So Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/Gleeman. Great time to, just sign up. Spring training is right around the corner. We're going to be ramping up coverage. We're going to be doing more interviews. We're going to be breaking everything down. We'll both be in Fort Myers doing the shows from there. You'll be able to hear the crack of the bat behind us.
Exactly right.
On the field, the back fields and stuff. So sign up, patreon.com/Gleeman. So I guess I think they really started to view Arraez as a first baseman DH, which is not the end of the world, right. But what it means is two things. One, you need to start comparing from the Twins' point of view, start comparing his offensive value to that of first baseman and DHs. You can't compare them to league average or second baseman or middle infielders or anything like that. Right. You have to look and say, where does his batting average, on base percentage, slugging percentage, on OPS plus, whatever your runs created, whatever your stat of choice is, where does that kind of put him in the hierarchy of first baseman? And even last year,
whereas the Marlins, on the other end, can compare him to second base, the middle infielders,
right? Until they come to their senses, they can. But last year he won a batting title. Right. And he made his first All-Star team. That's as good as he's been. I'm not going to say it's as good as it's going to get, although I likely believe that. And he ranked out of...
He's 25 years old.
Right, he's 25 years old.
Right.
Out of first baseman and DHs, regular first baseman and DHs last year, he ranked 15th in OPS and I think 14th in OPS plus. That's good. I mean, obviously it made him the All-Star team and all that, but it's not... I don't know. It's not an elite guy at a position, and that's no knock against Arraez. He's about as good as you can be playing first base DH and hitting 8 home runs. Right. Because the positions are just so filled with...
He gets on base.
The biggest sluggers. Right. The biggest sluggers. And it's very hard when you're hitting 6 or 8. He hit 8 homers last year, which was more than he had in his entire career up to that point. It's just hard when you're hitting 8 homers and you look over at the other team and their first baseman's got 28 home runs. Like you have to do so many small things, which he does, as we just talked about, to kind of make up for that. And, you look at the elite first baseman, the MVP type of guys, they're also hitting 290. Right. But they have, 35 home runs and 40 doubles and all that stuff. So,
to go out and get a 790 OPS first baseman.
Right.
The Twins could give up a lot less than a number 2 starting pitcher. Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And but beyond that, I still think what really pushed them to... Because they weren't looking to trade Arraez, and we should note along those lines, he's a good
fit for this team.
They turned down the Marlins' offer of Lopez for Arraez. Dan Hayes reported that a little while ago. The Twins said, no, we're not doing a 1-for-1. I mean, this wasn't a situation where they were going and dangling Arraez for one starting pitcher. They said no smartly, and then the Marlins gave them 2 prospects, one of whom, Jose Salas, is like a fairly legit prospect. We can talk about him in a second too. But I think
in part they did that because Lopez is under contract or under team control for 2 more years, and Arraez is under team control for 3 more years. And
correct.
Even if they are comparable performers, comparable in value, you still get that extra year of control with Arraez. So you want something on top of that, and that's directly what Falvey called out when asked about the prospects. Now he had to be careful about what he said on that because Lopez was also on the call. Like, you're not going to say, well, Arraez is worth more than Lopez.
It's a funny dynamic when the player is on the call because he can't ask quite as many questions. But the other thing with Arraez, and anybody who's watched him over the last 3 or 4 years has seen this, which is his legs are a real problem. And I think there are worries from the Twins, not that he's going to cease being a decent player, but the idea of even moving him to first base DH in the second half last year didn't keep him from having months-long hamstring problems, which, by the way, he only hit 285 in the second half. He was a below-average first baseman in the second half, which is why his overall numbers are just sort of good but not great in a year where he hit like 340 in the first half. He really slumped, and he was clearly playing at 80% or whatever.
Right.
And just think of how many times you've watched Arraez over the years where he'd just take a routine swing, and all of a sudden he's hopping around in the batter's box, or he's got to take a walk for a second. Let alone he tries to go first to third, or he lays out for a play defensively. There's always just these little moments where you're like, oh, is he okay? And he's had knee surgery in the minors. He's had a couple of different seasons in the majors now impacted by knee problems. He worked last offseason with Nelson Cruz to strengthen his legs, and obviously it worked in the first half. I mean, he was phenomenal in the first half, and then he spent the entire second half kind of limping around with a hamstring problem.
It's clear he is doing the same workout with Nelson Cruz and stuff this offseason. He is working the problem.
It's not
There's
for a
no
lack
question
of
about that
effort. It's just, I mean, I remember,
and he might be getting better and better and better. We'll see, but he's also getting older and older and older.
Right. It's not. It doesn't. I mean, I remember reading about Tony Oliva back in the day, which was like he had bad knees, and then he had an injury, and he had really bad knees, and that just it ended his career ultimately. And I'm not saying the Twins feel that Arraez is in that position, but that plays a part in why they view him more as a DH type than as a second baseman or third baseman or left fielder or whatever. Now, for this to work, it's one thing to view him as a first baseman DH, but for that to work, as you kind of hinted at, well, now you need to then get similar or better production from other first basemen and DHs. Because you can say, oh, well, we viewed Arraez as a first baseman DH now. Except he was still a pretty good first baseman DH. I mean, I think he was just fine defensively. I think, as long as he's hitting 300, he's going to be an above average or average player at the position at worst.
Of course.
But, I mean, you look at what they have, Kirilloff, Larnach, Wallner, Nick Gordon, Ed Julian, and those are just the lefties. You start to add in, some of the Austin Martin types, Bryce Lewis, Brooks Lee. They're going to be making room for these guys. And as we saw with Arraez, some of them are going to shift down the defensive spectrum. Edward Julian's playing second base now at Double-A.
Yeah.
He could easily end up as a first baseman, as a DH, as a left fielder. We've seen Kirilloff might end up at first base, even though he was a corner outfielder for most of his career. Wallner might end up a DH, even though he was a right fielder, that sort of thing. Austin Martin's playing short at AAA or Double-A.
Yep.
Nobody thinks he's going to be at short. So there's a lot of moving parts. They need to be right that at least a couple of those guys can come in, and they're not going to duplicate Arraez's batting average, but they could potentially get you an 800 OPS, which is what you were getting from Arraez anyway. I think that so much of the Arraez thing comes down to not his value, which was plenty good, but sort of how he got to that value, or the way he got that value, the aesthetics involved, which is he was a lot of fun to watch.
Right.
Like, it's not so much that he was, X runs better than somebody else. It was watching that type of player, particularly in a time when home runs and strikeouts are the entire game. It's fun to watch a guy who just never strikes out and just laces singles all over the plate. It takes you back to a time, for some of us, that was before we were even really watching baseball that much. And I think that's never going to go away. And because of that, there is a chunk of the fan base who just sort of fell in love with Arraez. And no matter how this trade looks on paper now, or even how it turns out, barring Pablo Lopez winning a Cy Young award or something like that, people are going to hate this trade. And I think we deal with that a lot with the Twins, which is like they do move sometimes, and it's like, there's a logic to this, and there's a decent chance this looks good, but man, people are hate it in the meantime.
Right.
And I really think this is the primest example of that. And I don't really know there's nothing to like intellectually tell somebody about that. I'm also going to miss watching and covering Luis Arraez. Luis Arraez was a great dude to cover. He was a great dude to watch every day. He was a lot of fun, and he was a really good player. But I think we don't need to make him into more than he was in terms of like all-around value just because the way he got to his value was so unique and such a throwback and so fun. Like, you know, he still had a .415 slugging percentage or whatever as a first. I mean, you just can't. You can't make a living at first base doing that. Yeah. It's very tricky. So, but with that said, you know, they need some of these other lefty bats to step up, including Kirilloff in the most.
Kirilloff's a big one. Like if Kirilloff becomes the guy we thought he was going to be 2 years ago, we're not going to miss. Nobody's going to miss Luis Arraez, right? And I mean, we should just call out like again. We've talked a lot about Luis Arraez, both his strengths and his weaknesses. They made it very clear they did not want to trade away Luis Arraez. They traded away Luis Arraez because they wanted to get Pablo Lopez really bad. So before we dive into Pablo Lopez a lot, let's just cover our sponsor real quick.
BetterHelp, which we've advertised before. Right. The way BetterHelp works is if you want to talk to someone about something going on in your life,
That's right.
which is a big umbrella, I realize, but it's important. And you're like, there are days you wake up and you go, I'd like to talk to someone, but it's such a pain to set something up and see if it works.
It's a pain just to get to the point where you're ready to talk to somebody about something, right? And then you get on top of that the extra obstacle,
the hoops you've got to jump through.
Who am I talking to?
Right.
Like who do I trust?
This simplifies that entire process.
Where do they live? Where do they work? And when can we meet? And
you can do.
Are they already full?
You can do. Relax now.
I mean, it's.
You can do. If you want to talk to somebody, but you don't want to go to their office, like John's saying, you can do a video chat. If you're someone who goes, I don't really want to be on video, you can just do an audio chat. If you're someone, and I have days like this where it's like, I don't even want to talk to somebody on the phone, you can just type to them and do a live chat. They will set up whatever you're comfortable with doing. They will remove whatever kind of barrier for entry or obstacles there are in getting this set up.
Including the barrier of like affordability. You know, because
it's also less expensive.
That's right, less expensive, right?
And so if you want to give them a try, it's called BetterHelp. You can go to betterhelp.com/Gleeman and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gleeman.
Yeah.
Okay. So
one of our favorite sponsors.
Yeah, we can talk about Lopez. I'm just trying to make sure we hit everything on Luis Arraez. I don't want to give him short shrift because he's been a big part of this team. Right. But yeah, I mean, I think the fact that he kind of has reached the bottom, at least in the Twins' mind, of the defensive spectrum at age 25, the fact that even at the bottom of the defensive spectrum, it's been difficult to keep his legs healthy and keep him productive for entire seasons.
Right.
And I just think that the fact that he's part of what makes him fun is the same thing that leads to skepticism at first base or DH, which is part of what makes him fun is he's different than everyone else.
Right.
He's 5'0", 100 and nothing, and he just slaps singles all over the place.
A week and a half ago, one of the blogs at Twins Daily compared him, took a look at his top 10 comps in Baseball Reference, and amongst them are Tony Gwynn and maybe a couple of other Hall of Famers, and then the other 7 guys are all from the 19th century.
Right.
Right. I mean, they were all born before 1900. Right. Like that's his game, and that does make it interesting to watch. It's one of the things I appreciated about watching.
But
it.
It also lends itself toward what I would say is justified skepticism, which is like if you're going to now kind of put him in the bucket with all the other first basemen and DHs, and he's sitting there, he's the only one that can't hit 15 home runs. He's the only one that can't be taller than 5'9". He's the only one that can't do this and can't do that. And that's not to say he isn't capable of being one of the better guys in that group.
Right.
But he's not capable of being one of the best, like the truly elite of that group. I mean, we saw last year. That was him at his best. And he was like, he was the 10th best first baseman in baseball or something like that. And so I think that becomes tricky. Like to replace his fun factor and replace his personality is going to be extremely difficult.
Right.
To replace his batting average is going to be impossible. But to replace his production, replace his on-base skills, replace the mix of on-base skills and slugging, the total of OPS, however you want to view production, is doable. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but it is doable. Like there's a very real possibility that Larnach or Wallner or Kirilloff or Julian can produce similarly.
Or even acquiring somebody from outside.
Like you could do that. As you mentioned, like this takes a left-handed bat away. I still will pound the table and say I don't know why they haven't brought in a alternative to Kyle Garlick as a right-handed bat for the outfield or just wherever. But even at this late date, when the free agent market has been completely picked over, you can throw a rock and hit, Luke Voigt or Robbie Grossman or somebody like that, who's probably available for a 1-year, $3 million deal or something like that, and is just a right-handed first base DH left field type and can get you 250 with 20 homers and get you 750, 780, 800 OPS. And that's kind of when he's in that bucket, he's in it with those guys. Now, with that said, from the Marlins standpoint, I mean, they made it clear all offseason that they were looking for bats. They were linked to Kepler at one point. They also seem to really be prioritizing low strikeout rates, bat-to-ball skills with some of their other acquisitions. I mean, we'll see if it works out. It's an interesting approach. It's a real zig when the rest of baseball is zagging. And Arraez is the example of that in baseball. He has the lowest strikeout rate. He literally had the highest batting average last year. So I see why the Marlins targeted him. They also seem to have a very real ability to develop young starting pitchers, including Lopez, but they have 3 or 4 either just debuted in the majors or coming up through the high minors. Plus, they have the reigning Cy Young winner in Alcantara. Yeah. So similar to how the Twins looked at this and said, we got all kinds of left-handed bats in the majors and coming up through the high minors. We could potentially make this one with bad legs and limited to first base available for a pitcher. The Marlins, on the flip side, said, we got all kinds of young pitching. We need some bats, and we want high batting average, low strikeout guys. Well, of course, Luis Arraez is going to be first on that list. So I get it from that
standpoint. At a middle infield position, right?
I get it from that standpoint. For the Twins, for this to work, I mean, there's a few paths to it. One, as we just said, one of these young left-handed bats steps up at the DH spot or at first base or even in the outfield and replaces essentially Arraez's production. That makes this work right away. Right. Another is one of the 2 prospects they got, Salas or Chiriot, ends up being a regular in the majors. If that happens, then this is going to look like a pretty good trade.
Both, by the way, very young.
Yes, one's 18 or one's 19, one's 17.
And my guess is the 19-year-old maybe even starts the season at high A still. He will. I don't think he's close to double A yet. So it's going to be a while before we see him. Right.
But really, what this trade was about is Pablo Lopez,
correct.
And we've talked this whole offseason about how the Twins were in kind of a unique for them circumstance with the rotation, which is most off seasons, especially past 5 to 6 years under this regime, front office regime, it's been clear like, oh, they need 3 starters. Or they have some 4th and 5th options, but they need somebody like a Sonny Gray who can kind of front this rotation. Well, that was the case even last offseason. They got Sonny Gray. Right. Sonny Gray was immediately their best starter after they traded Barrios. But this year, you look at it, and they didn't need at any point the Chris Archer, Dylan Bundy, Matt Shoemaker, Jay Happ type of guys,
right.
Which I'm thankful for that. Right. Because they didn't have a perfect rotation by any means, but they had 5 non-prospect guys, right. Sonny Gray, Tyler Mahle, Kenta Maeda, Bailey Ober, Joe Ryan. And then they had the prospect guys, Louis Varland, Simeon Woods Richardson, Balazovic, Josh Winder.
They have 5 guys that every day you feel like, oh, that's a good guy to be out there. Hey,
they're average or better starting pitchers. Right. And that's a unique spot for the Twins to be in when you have a 5-man rotation full of that. And one of the things we talked about that kind of stems from that is the idea of it's not as simple as just saying, oh, they should go out and trade for so-and-so as a starting pitcher, like we've said in past offseasons.
Michael Wacha.
Yeah, or sign
Michael Wacha, right.
Because it doesn't do you any good if you sign a 4th starter or you trade for a 3rd starter if they're not actually a clear upgrade over the 5 you already have in place, because then they're bumping from the rotation someone. And that, I think, is worth debating with Lopez, how much of an upgrade he provides over Ober.
Probably
Ryan,
Ober is the key
whoever.
one, right? Like right. Odds are, if everybody stays healthy, which we'll talk about in a second, right? But if everybody stays healthy, odds are Ober would be sent to AAA. I think he's got options left, right? Yeah. And so if that's the case, then how much better is he going to be than Ober?
Right. But now, and I think that's debatable. I do think he's a better bet than those guys. But I would certainly put him, if we're putting guys in buckets like we did with Luis Arraez, I would put him just in terms of overall ability in a similar bucket to Sonny Gray, Kenta Maeda, and Tyler Mahle.
Sure.
And you hope that Joe Ryan and Ober get into that bucket this year too, which is solid number 2/number 3, 2.5 starter, I call him.
And I'm optimistic about Ober. I think Ober can be in that bucket right away, but you also are counting on all 5 of them to be healthy.
Well, that's the key. To me, that's the key, which is if it's debatable that Lopez for the past year or the past 3 years is a significant upgrade over any of those 5 guys, then you go, well, why would it be worth sending away Luis Arraez to get maybe a small or minimal upgrade there?
Right.
And the reason is twofold. One, all those 5 guys I listed, 4 of them have injury concerns.
Right.
2 of them have significant injury concerns, which is Kenta Maeda hasn't pitched
I
in
would
like
say 3.
Well, Kenta Maeda hasn't pitched in like 18 months because he's coming back from Tommy John surgery. Well, that we don't know what we're going to get from Kenta Maeda. He was supposed to pitch in September last year, and they didn't have him pitch. Everyone's saying he'll be ready for spring training. We'll see. I mean, he's 35 years old. Right. He's coming off elbow surgery. There's no way you can count on him making 30 starts and pitching 175 innings. They would like that. Right. And then Tyler Mahle is a massive question mark. He made 2 starts after the Twins got him, and there's nothing they can point to that's even correctable. It's just his shoulder kind of gave out.
Right.
That's like great. So he's just going to be, that's going to loom. So those are huge questions.
And then
Ober hasn't made it through a full season yet and has injury.
Right. I mean, what's the top number of innings he's ever thrown? Has he ever thrown 100?
Probably, yeah, something like that.
Right.
And then Sonny Gray had all kinds of hamstring problems last year, and has also just never been the most durable starter even in past years. And so I do think you can look at those 5 and say, well, yeah, is Lopez an upgrade over a couple of those guys? Yeah. Is he a massive upgrade? No, but that's actually a good thing because that means they have pretty good rotation depth. But that only matters if those 5 guys are all healthy. And as we've seen, that's just not going to be the case.
Right.
The Twins use double-digit starters every year, including, the last couple of years they've used an absurd number of starters. And so it might be tricky if all 5 of those guys and Lopez are healthy come spring training and at the end of camp, somebody's going to have to go. They're not going to use a 6-man rotation.
Right.
But
I don't think they will.
They're not. But those guys are not going to stay healthy. I mean, it's not – even if they had a pretty good health track records, which as we just said they don't, the 5 are not going to – no team is counting on 5 starters staying healthy. And so instead of your 6th starter then being a minor league person, your 6th starter is now Ober.
Right.
Or your 6th starter is now Lopez, however you choose to look at it. And so – but the second part of that equation is next year, 2024.
Right.
When they still will have Lopez under team control, his final year under team control. Right. He'll be 27 years old. And at that point, Mahle, Gray, and Maeda will have been free agents.
All be free agents.
And so then you're saying, well, now you're back to what's usually been the case for the Twins at the start of off seasons, which is, they only have 2 or 3 starters.
Right.
Well, now you have Lopez, in addition to Joe Ryan, in addition to Ober, in addition to hopefully Varland, Woods Richardson, Winder, some combination. Chris Paddock, right.
We should mention.
So they're giving themselves more options for 2024, and then obviously you could try to work to extend him or whatever. But those are the big keys, and I think it's also funny. Like they re-sign Correa, and any skeptical Twins fan at that point said the same thing, which was, that's great. What about the pitching? Well, they agreed, obviously. They went out and they traded one of their best hitters for a pitcher. And people are like, no, not that way.
It's clear that's been a priority all offseason. Right? I mean, the fact that they have been talking about Arraez Lopez for months, right, said they agreed right from the beginning. When it became clear that Scherzer and DeGrom were not going to sign here, Rodon was going to get crazy money. They started exploring what the other options are. One of those options was Lopez, and they really liked Arraez, and that's how you get the deal done.
In terms of what Lopez brings, he's had some arm problems in the past. 2021, he missed the second half, most of the second half with shoulder problems. Last year, he stayed healthy in the sense that he made 32 starts, which is 33 is like the maximum you'll see, and he threw 180 innings, which would have led the Twins by like 30 or 40 innings. But he did fade a little bit in the second half. He had a great first half, like a all-star caliber first half, and then he had like a 4-something ERA in the second half. Although I looked a little bit strikeout and walk numbers were pretty similar. He gave up a handful more home runs, which really accounted for a lot of it. And I'm not saying that's bad, but it's not an example of a guy
I'll also put I took a look at who the starts were against.
Yeah.
He was facing a lot better teams in the second half, too. I mean, one of the things that maybe we'll get to in terms of him moving to the Twins is he doesn't have to face the Phillies, the Mets, the Braves, 10 times a year, which is what he had to do up till this point.
Yeah, but I don't know that offensively those are that scary. I mean, it's a good division, but yeah, but that's going to be true of any pitcher they get who's not in the AL Central already is going to be come from a place where they faced better competition than the AL Central. Right. But yeah, over the last 3 years, so since 2020, Lopez has a 3.52 ERA and slightly more than one strikeout per inning. That's really good. Now, the Marlins, for 2 of those 3 years, or no, actually only one, played in a DH-less league.
Well, that's true.
Because 2020 and last year were DH. Yeah. Their ballpark, suppresses runs a little bit. But, I mean, I think he's very similar to, in terms of overall performance the last 2 or 3 years, Sonny Gray, Tyler Mahle, Kenta Maeda, a really good number 3 starter and a pretty good number 2 starter, especially the way they view him at 26 years old. That's
the other key. 26 years old is the other part.
Right.
Yeah.
And
while he's had those shoulder issues, the fact that similar to, like, say, watching Rodon, right? The fact that he seems like he's figured out something on that shoulder to the point where he can get 32 starts. Now, maybe it still wasn't as strong as he wanted to be in the second half, or maybe it was. I don't know exactly what his problems were in the second half, whether it was that related or not. But it's good to see the trend upward.
Yes, I agree. I mean, yeah, look, 32 starts in 180 innings. That's qualify as a horse for the Twins. That's an incredible workload for a Twin starter.
Right. It's been since Barrios that we've seen that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
No, it was only 2 years ago. But yes, you're right. You're right. I mean, in terms of what he's like stylistically, we talked a lot about Arraez stylistically. Lopez, what you're going to see from him is 93, 94 with the fastball, four-seam fastball, a really good kind of 87 to 89 mile an hour changeup that he throws to righties and lefties. Yeah. You can go look at some video. I mean, he just gets some crazy swings and misses. That is definitely his go-to pitch. He threw it 35% of the time last year. It wouldn't surprise me if he ups that a little bit. Yeah.
He's not quite a two-pitch pitcher, but he's close to a two-pitch pitcher.
Although I think the curveball that he's only thrown 8% of the time has a chance to be a really nice third pitch. It wouldn't surprise me if that was one of the kind of tweaks they have planned for him, is get that up to 15%, make it a real something that hitters at least have to have in the back of their mind as a third pitch that gives them a different look. But yeah, I mean, he's got a good but not great fastball, a really good, borderline great changeup coming from the right side. Throws a total of 5 pitches. He cuts some fastballs. He sinks some fastballs in addition to the normal four seam, and then he throws that curveball too. You look at him, and he's not a guy who's susceptible really to matchups, because the changeup from a righty does a lot to neutralize lefties. Right. He's a guy who can throw strikes. He's a guy who, when needed, can get ground balls, and he's a guy who can miss bats. I mean, he's not going to be a guy who gets 15 strikeouts in a game, although he did set or tie the major league record for most strikeouts to begin a game with 9 last year, I think, or in 2021. But he's at 9 strikeouts per 9 innings. He gets you a dozen once in a while in a game, which for the Twins, again, is a lot of strikeouts for a starting pitcher. I think he's pretty aesthetically pleasing as a pitcher. I mean, I've watched him a lot over the last couple of years, in part because I thought he'd be someone that would interest the Twins, but also he's just a fun young pitcher to watch. But a couple other things I've heard that we could kind of debunk here is, one, the idea that this was done because of money in any way is just, I mean, it's on its face, it's
when
wrong.
I saw that reaction, I just assumed it's based on sort of 40 years worth of being a Twins fan, where it's like when they trade away my favorite player, it's always because of money.
Right.
We lost Knobloch because of money. We lost.
Here's the reality, though. Right? I think that's true. But even setting aside the Twins specifically, and I fall victim to this too, because sometimes I go on the radio thinking I'm going to talk about the Twins.
Right.
And instead I get asked about a question about the Vikings.
Right.
Of whom I'm a very casual fan. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to say I can't answer that. I don't have the information. So what happens is the less information you have about a topic, when you're attempting to give an opinion on that topic, inevitably you go to the sort of cliche stuff or the old reliable, here are the talking points. And if you don't know who Pablo Lopez is, I'm going to do that a lot this season. Mix up Jorge and Pablo. If you don't know who Pablo Lopez is and you don't know the prospects they're getting are, and you're not that familiar with this and that, but you just know you liked watching Luis Arraez and you know the Twins, like you said, have a history of being cheap, you go, well, this deal was obviously made for money reasons. Well, do you think the people screaming about that know the arbitration process and they know Super 2 and they know all this stuff? No. Right. Well, here's the reality. Jorge Lopez, God, I keep doing that. Pablo Lopez, excuse me. That's going to be a disaster for me. Pablo Lopez is going to make $5.5 million this year via the arbitration process. Right. He's already settled with the Marlins on his contract. Luis Arraez is also going through the arbitration process, chose not to settle, which means he'll probably go through a hearing, although he could settle with the Marlins now. He will make somewhere between $5 and $6.1 million. Right. Well, do you know what the exact midpoint between $5 and $6.1 million? It's $5.5 million, which is what Pablo Lopez makes. At most, this will save the Twins $600,000. Right. They have a $150 million payroll. Do you think they care about less than the minimum salary?
And by the way, it's probably going to be similar next year as well. Yes. 2024, it'll be the same thing.
And Lopez will be in a position to get paid sooner, like really get paid sooner than Luis Arraez will. And here's the other reality. Luis Arraez is never going to get paid some huge contract. If you're waiting for him to become Carlos Correa as a free agent, it's just never going to happen. This skill set does not – 8 home run first basemen with bad knees do not get $200 million. Now, $75 million, $100 million, maybe. Sure. But if Lopez is healthy for the next 2 years, he's going to get $100 and something million. So that to me was just an example of wanting to be mad, which I get because all the reason we talked about people don't want to see Luis Arraez leave. I don't necessarily want to see Luis Arraez leave either. He was a lot of fun. And being like, well, what can I be mad about? Well, the easiest thing to be mad about he's a batting champion.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, true. Yeah. And, obviously over money. It's a decent chance that at no point in their careers where Luis Arraez costs significantly more than Pablo Lopez. I think
or even as much.
Right.
I'd be willing to bet he makes less this year than Lopez does this year.
Well, it's like a coin flip, right?
We'll find
out. I mean, he could make 6.1, but I mean, that's the same. Right. The other thing I saw, and Royce got all worked up about this, he said, well, they're really going to miss how many pitches Luis Arraez saw at the top of this lineup. Yeah. Carlos Correa, bat number 2, really benefited from Luis Arraez working counts and fouling off pitches and blah, blah, blah. Well, I was like, that's interesting. Let me look that up. It's just not true. He sees no more pitches than an average hitter. Last year, the major league average was 3.9 pitches per plate appearances. Luis Arraez was at 4.0 pitches per plate appearances. Right. He was 41st out of 130 qualified batters. So, top quarter, but not top 10% or anything like that, let alone at the top. And
I think they'll miss his on-base percentage.
Yes.
I think they're going to miss having him as a leadoff hitter.
Absolutely.
Right?
But there's no need, there's this tendency to be like, let's try to squeeze even more out of this thing than there needs to be. I mean, the reality is Joey Gallo sees more pitches than Luis Arraez. Miguel Sano saw more pitches than Luis Arraez. And I saw Royce, he was like, people pointed that out to him, and he was like, well, yeah, but it's different the way Arraez sees the pitches than, well, yeah, fine. But again, it goes back to what we talked about with Sano.
Yeah, I'm not claiming I want Miguel Sano leading off for us. Just so
absolutely. But with Gallo and Sano, these high strikeout guys, people assume because you strike out a lot that you have no plate discipline, that you're just hacking. Right. But the opposite is true. Part of the reason those guys strike out a lot is they're always taking pitches and being 2-2, 3-2, and then they have a lot of swing and miss, so they only get one crack at it and they swing and miss. Well, the flip side is when you see a guy like Arraez who hits 310, 320, and rarely strikes out, in your head it's very easy to connect those skills and say, boy, he must be so patient at the plate. He's not patient at the plate. He doesn't swing at bad pitches, but when a pitch is in the strike zone, he swings at it, and because he never swings and misses, he puts the ball in play every time. And so he has shorter at-bats.
I'll suggest this as well. pitchers are more willing to throw him a strike because he's not going to be taking it out to left field.
Yes, I mean we've seen that
it into the bleachers
with all kinds of players. Right. I mean the percentage of, and you can look at this now, in zone pitches that players see, roughly 50-50 balls and strikes. Right. They correlate to really two things. One, as you mentioned, how much power does a guy have? Right. You're going to throw fewer strikes to Aaron Judge than you are Luis Arraez. Right. Because what's the worst Luis Arraez is going to do? He's going to rip a single somewhere, maybe a double somewhere. What's the worst Aaron Judge is going to do? He's going to dent the scoreboard, 450 feet away. The other way it correlates is chase. Like there are some, Eddie Rosario, pitcher, even though he had power, pitchers didn't have to throw him pitches in the strike zone because they knew he would go after pitches that weren't in the strike zone. Now, that's not true of Arraez, but that's not necessarily true of Sano and Gallo either. I mean, there's that perception, which is going to be hard to crack. But Miguel Sano and Joey Gallo don't strike out a lot because they're undisciplined. It's actually because they are disciplined, and then when they choose to swing, they swing and miss a lot. So I think all those things kind of tie into, it's very natural to be like, it was fun watching Luis Arraez. Here are also kind of ancillary things that he's good at. Right. But we know those aren't really true. Yeah. Which isn't to say he's an impatient hitter, but like Correa saw more pitches, Gallo saw more pitches, Polanco saw more pitches, Buxton, and even like guys like Larnach and Jeffers and Celestino saw the same number of pitches per plate appearances than Luis Arraez. There's no need to sort of tack on things that may or may not be true. You can just talk about him being a really good player, which he is. You don't have to be like this kind of mystique and aura to it.
Right. If you make a quadrant of, power on one axis and chase percentage on the other axis, right? The ones that are A, will chase, and B, have a lot of power are the ones that are going to get the least strikes, right? Arraez is in the opposite end of that quadrant, right? He is A, he doesn't chase, and B, he doesn't particularly scare you that much. So, he's going to see a lot of strikes. And when you see a lot of strikes, you tend not to have, even if you are really disciplined and you tend to have shorter at bats. You just tend to see
and also he just doesn't swing and miss. When he swings, the at bat is usually over because he's putting the ball in play. When Miguel Sano swings, it's 50-50. If it's going to be over, well, it could be over on a strikeout. But here's a couple other things. The prospects, let's talk a little bit about. So the Marlins have been pushing for this trade. Okay. And the Twins basically said 1-for-1 doesn't get it done for us. In part because, Arraez, I would argue, is a slightly better player per year than Lopez. And because, as you said, they have 3 years of Arraez and only 2 of Lopez. So to bridge that gap, you need some value. And the Marlins, you look at their roster, there isn't a lot there that you'd necessarily want. I know the Twins maybe had some interest in Garrett Cooper, who's like a right-handed, he's like a Kyle Garlick type.
Before they signed Vasquez, I thought they were kind of interested in some of their catchers.
Maybe. Yep. You could maybe try to get a reliever for them or something like that, but ultimately they said we'll take prospect value, and Jose Salas is the main guy that they sent back. There's also Byron Churio. They sent the 2 players, but Jose Salas, I reached out to a whole bunch of people with the Twins and with other teams who evaluate prospects, scouting side guys. He's 19. He's a switch-hitting shortstop who played last year at high A, got to high A by the end of the season.
Low A and high A, right? Yep.
Was signed in 2019, was one of the highest touted international players when he was 16, signed for $2.9 million with the Marlins. His brother just was the highest paid international player of this cycle last week. Got like $6 million. And there's a third brother. So I mean, this is a family that is producing big time talent. The kind of midi scouting report on Salas is 6'2", skinny, has a chance to fill out, add some power.
Again, we mentioned before, only 19 years old and in high A at 19 years old.
Right. They pushed him pretty aggressively. And, he held his own, I would say. I mean, I think he's gotten on base. He's shown a little bit of power. He's not struck out a ton. He's drawn some walks. He stole 33 bases and was only caught once last year. There are definitely people who think, depending on how he kind of fills out physically, he could definitely be a big...
And they feel he's going to fill out.
Right. But there are people who think he could be like a Carlos Correa type shortstop. And I don't mean like Correa as a player type. I just mean body type. Right. The more of the Cal Ripken, J.J. Hardy, Carlos
tall,
Correa.
muscular shortstop. Right.
And if he has to move to second or third, we'll see about that. But the idea behind him is He's been a borderline top 100 prospect. I saw Baseball Prospectus actually put him 93rd right before the trade.
Okay.
Everybody, Baseball America, MLB.com had him as like either the 4th or 5th best Marlins prospect.
Right.
Their system is not great, but I would say he's somewhere in the 8 to 12 range probably for the Twins prospects now. I'd have to think about it a little more, but
guess is he's 100 to 150 overall.
Yeah,
would be
I would say that's
maybe a little
fair.
higher.
He's a B level prospect, and Byron Churio is only 17,
right,
and was signed for $200,000 a couple of years ago as an international prospect. He just completed his first pro season in the Dominican Summer League, which is the lowest level of professional baseball, basically.
He's not even in A-ball. He's not going to probably be in A-ball.
Right. I mean, he'll probably be in the Florida Complex
League
League this year, I'm guessing. And he hit 340 with walks and steals and stuff. So
he was the star of the Dominican.
Right. I mean, it's possible that
Summer
neither of these guys factor into anything. I mean, they're 19 and 17.
And the interesting thing about it is that so often the Twins have been trying to target high minors guys because, frankly, they've got their window open right now. This is the time when they want that talent coming up. They want to be able to. They have guys who are going to become free agents, or they're going to become expensive, or this or that. They want to have the people that can fill in for that. These two are. It's going to be 2025 before we see the earliest one of these, and maybe later.
I think part of it is, as we just talked about, we listed all those names on the position player side. They have middle infielders, outfielders, left-handed bats, some right-handed bats. Like they have 6 or 7 Double-A and Triple-A, or even some guys like Wallner and Larnach who've been in the majors already. They don't necessarily need another MLB ready. I mean, you'd prefer MLB ready, but I think this is an example of them trying to maximize the value that they're getting along with Lopez in this deal, even if it's far away value, even if it's coin flip lottery ticket type of value. Like they're trying to maximize 5 years from now the ability to maximize the value of this trade, which we talked about this on the Patreon. I actually give the front office credit because for a front office that is now in their 7th year to be trading and is receiving plenty of criticism after back-to-back losing seasons, to be trading for a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, it would be easy for them to just say, we got to win now. Otherwise, we might not be around 4 or 5 years from now. And so I give them credit for not taking that approach and for saying, we want the value as much of it, however it comes, whether that's a 19-year-old, whether that's a 29-year-old, whether that's a major league reliever, whether it's a backup catcher, whether it's a guy who signed at 16 a year ago.
Well, and what we've seen, especially at the last trade deadline, is they are willing to trade away those prospect guys, especially if they are several years away from the majors. They're not going to necessarily help in 2023, 2024, so this helps replenish some of what they gave up to get Molly and Lopez and Fulmer, right? And, I mean, on top of that, they also have the number 5 overall pick in the draft coming up. That will also help sort of replenish some of that stuff. And we've seen they are not afraid to trade recent draft picks.
I think that's a key point.
And these guys are kind of like recent draft picks. They're the age of recent draft picks, right?
The Twins under this regime, particularly kind of once this regime got comfortable, after 2-3 years or whatever, that's one of to me, the biggest difference between this group and the Terry Ryan-led group of the previous 2 decades, which is Terry Ryan held prospects so tightly and so closely, in part because he came up that way. He was a scout. That's his background. Yep. And in part because
I think that's the part of the job he enjoyed.
Oh,
he enjoyed watching prospects become players.
Last year, he was at Target Field scouting.
Yes, right.
I mean, this guy's 70 years old. He doesn't have to be there.
Right.
I mean, I would talk to him. Who are you looking at today? And he'd be like, I'm looking at so-and-so.
That is why he loved the job.
Yes.
He loved
But I also think because he kind of came up and got that job once Andy McPhail left, he was the right-hand man there and got that job in the 90s, in the mid-90s, when things were real ugly.
Right.
And these payrolls were real low, like 30th in the league low. I mean, those payrolls are why people still assume the Twins are cheap because of those mid-90s and late 90s payrolls. He viewed that as the only real way to build a consistently competent team, which is you can't go sign Carlos Correa or even Josh Donaldson or, for that matter, even Christian Vasquez.
Right.
You just have to constantly have minimum salaried young talent that you can bring up every year and build around. And so he didn't want to trade away prospects. He would rather trade for prospects. Whereas this regime, they've certainly traded for prospects. They've certainly worked the farm system and built it up at various times. But they view – I mean, we've talked a lot about this actually. There are 2 ways to get value from a prospect. So much of the focus is on the first most obvious way, which is You develop
become
them,
a good player.
You call them up,
Right.
and then you let them go for 10. You watch them for 10 years. The other way that a lot of teams do, including like the Yankees, is you develop these guys as best you can, and you make other teams fall in love with them, and then you turn them into major league players through trades. Yeah. And we've seen the Twins over the last 18 months do a lot of that. And so I think, will Jose Salas ever be the Twins starting shortstop? Probably not. Does he have a chance to play second or third or whatever for the Twins? Yes. But there's also a chance they just trade him a year or 2 or 3 from now, in which case the trade tree, the branches of that trade tree just keep kind of, a new branch sprouts. Because it's like, if they were to trade Chiriot or Salas for a major league reliever or starting pitcher or as a package of a trade, well, then you're kind of just extending the value of Arraez over and over again, which they've done quite a bit of.
And with this trade had a little bit of a twist to it, in fact, in that regard, because one thing we have seen is over and over and over again, the Twins like to trade for, a better than average pitcher that has multiple years of team control, right? And in almost every other case, whether it was Jake Odorizzi or Kenta Maeda or Tyler Mahle or Sonny Gray, what they have done is they've gone and traded prospects for a couple years of team control on those things, right? All of them, right? Some of them pretty close to the majors, right? This time they went and got it, but they also got the prospects back. They weren't the ones giving up the prospects. They were getting the prospects back. And the way you do that is you trade a good regular player like Arraez. This trade has been the exception to the rule in terms of what they gave up. It's been their absolute template for what they acquire. Right? They made 5 or 6 of trades like this, right? But what they gave up this time was different. And maybe that's part of what is catching people by surprise as well. They're not. We're used to giving up a name that we don't really know that the prospect hounds are going to be upset about, right? But we get back. Hey, we get Tyler Mahle back. We get Sonny Gray back.
Very rarely,
we lose Chase, but we get right. We haven't seen this other side of it. I think it's interesting that they got a deal done the other way around.
I will also say, the reaction to this. It actually hasn't been as, it's all relative to who you're seeing and hearing from, but it hasn't been quite as negative as I expected. I think in part because our audience, both, I'll say my audience on The Athletic and on this podcast, are not lacking information necessarily. They're not just shouting about cliches and all that. It's not to say they didn't like watching Luis Arraez, but I've been kind of pleasantly surprised how neutral people have been to this trade, saying it does make sense, even though we're going to miss Arraez. What I'll also say is, outside of Minnesota, this trade seems to have almost universal praise for the Twins. I'll read you J.J. Cooper, who I just met at the winter meetings. He's the editor-in-chief of Baseball America. Here's what he tweeted the other day. He said, "It's interesting to see the disparities between national views on a trade and the fans' views. It seems in Minnesota, many fans are up in arms. But looking at it on a talent basis, the Twins getting 2 prospects thrown in makes this a pretty logical trade for Minnesota." I think that's the reaction I've gotten from people privately, just texting people who evaluate and say, "What do you think about this?" The 2 reactions I've gotten consistently are, this is a real interesting trade.
Right.
It's kind of a challenge trade. And
right.
also, I'm surprised the Twins were able to get one legit prospect and another guy who has some upside thrown into this. It doesn't. That's not the first. Joe Mauer's
that's a little bit of an industry insider kind of view. Do you know what I mean? You have to know who the prospects are, what's going on, for people to actually care about that.
I guess, but
the casual fan doesn't give a damn about Salas or
No, but nobody ever knows prospects.
Right.
Nobody ever knows another team's prospects.
Right.
Right. I mean,
exactly. Right. It's true.
You're going off rankings. You're going off all this stuff. But I think Joe Mauer's entire career was this way. I remember once a year, some writer from ESPN or The Ringer, I remember Michael Bauman came in to write a profile of Joe Mauer.
Joe Posnanski.
Yeah. And they all, sometimes they'd reach out to me and they'd be ask a question or get a quote or something like that. And they'd be like, have I stumbled across a subset of Twins fans who don't like Joe Mauer? And it's there's a loud and obnoxious.
Yeah.
And then you'd hear from them at the end of the week and they'd be like, I'm writing that he's on a clear Hall of Fame path, but everyone I talk to in Minnesota seems to think that's absurd. is this a thing? And I'm like, the further you get from Minnesota, the more Joe Mauer seems to be appreciated, which is the opposite of how things usually work in sports. Usually the hometown hero is overrated locally. And I guess it's the opposite, but now it's like people love Luis Arraez and people have become so attached to the things he does well, stylistically or from a performance standpoint, that they're so willing to overlook the weaknesses in his game or sort of the limitations to his game, especially as a first baseman, that national people don't care about that stuff. National people don't care that he has a little a wiggle he does before he steps into the box. They're just looking at production and team control and value and all that stuff. And I think when you look at it that way, they're trading 3 years of an above-average first baseman for 2 years of an above-average starting pitcher plus a couple of prospects. If you remove kind of the names and faces from that, I think that's a fairly logical trade, particularly for a team that has more bats than arms for the Twins. Now, that's not to say it's like some brilliant trade. We talked on the Patreon. I don't know that this is a trade I would have made. I think
I put out a poll just before this began, right? Basically saying, do you, and I give you 4 choices: love it, like it, dislike it, hate it. Right? 1,700 votes since we started the podcast on this. And no, these are my followers for the most part. Twins Daily put it out, etc. But I'm on the record as saying dislike it. You know, I don't like it. I dislike it. I'm not totally opposed to it. I don't hate it. I can see why you would do it. I don't know that I would have done it. Like if I was going to go yes or no, I'd probably go no. Right? 13% love it. 66% like it. So that's 79% are like it or above.
Okay.
16% dislike it. That's kind of where I fall into it.
Yeah.
And 5% hate it. I mean, that's 1,700 plus votes over a couple of hours. Now, it might be a little different if KFAN ran that poll, right? Right. That might be a little bit different population.
Yeah, it does frustrate me that we are constantly sort of asked to be responsible for the opinions of sometimes our friends, sometimes our acquaintances, sometimes people we're on the air with, sometimes people who just on a radio station that we're also on sometimes.
Right.
And it's like, oh, the guys on KFAN are ripping this. And I always want to be like, okay, what do you want me to do about it? Like, okay. That's the reason we thought there would be value in, Twins Daily or AaronGleeman.com or TwinsGeek.com or the Patreon podcast or the regular podcast. The idea that you don't have to just open up the newspaper that's on your step in the morning and rely on that for your Twins coverage. You don't have to just tune into whatever the number one sports station is and hear people who don't really even watch the Twins, let alone know the intricacies of salaries and prospects and all that stuff.
I would love to see KFA run that same poll too, because I do feel like what we get to at that. First of all, I think it's more casual Twins fans. There are a lot of really intense Vikings fans, but casual Twins fans, I'd like to see overall what their impressions. I think those percentages would be different.
Sure.
Right? And it also just sort of kind of does sort of point out, like, it is also possible to just have a really tiny, loud rage group, that ends up getting way more of course, attention than they should probably.
Especially when there's people with a megaphone leading those groups. I mean, the whole Polab pocket protector thing, like, we hear that constantly about payroll stuff, and those people don't actually want to hear what the payroll is. They don't want to hear that they've had an average payroll now for 5 years, including this season. Like, that's not part of the equation with them. The equation is they just want to be mad about stuff, and it's been true. And, people they like listening to have been screaming about it. So I've come to grips with that. Like, I'm not trying to correct every little thing that is said in places that are not here. And Lord knows we say stuff that people would have to correct too. I mean, we're hardly flawless.
And by the way, the negative spots I saw were not just from KFAN folks. There was a lot of established sportscasters or sports voices in this town that ended up
but that's the thing,
with a real negative view of
I
this.
think the less you're kind of digging into this, the more upset you'll be about this. And we have a lot of good sports personalities in the Twin Cities. We have a lot of good kind of general commentators and hosts and columnists and stuff like that.
Right.
But when the Vikings make a trade, I don't necessarily go to the common man to analyze it. Do you know what I mean? I go to a Reef to analyze it, or whoever. When the Timberwolves make a trade, God love them, but I don't necessarily say like, I wonder what Paul Allen thinks of this trade they made for 2, bench players and a draft pick or something like that. I say, I wonder what Dane Moore thinks about it or John Krasinski thinks about it. And
I was going to say Phil Miller. The Timberwolves make a trade.
Right.
Dude, am I going to Phil Miller to check? No, that's not what he covers.
And I'm in that boat too, because if I'm on the radio and the Vikings make some move, which by the way has happened a really strangely high number of times, like I walk into the studio and I remember the first one was they traded Percy Harvin like 3 minutes before I went on the air with PA. Right. And PA was like, "What do you think of the Percy Harvin trade?" And I wanted to be like, what are you asking me for? Right. But you do, and I'm guilty of that too, because I don't know that much about it, but I'll still give you an opinion if you ask me for it. And so I think the more you understand this stuff and the more you obsess about it, because let's be honest, it's not like we're smarter than anybody. We're just obsessed with the Twins. Right. I would probably argue we're dumber. Right. That means because we've devoted our lives to doing this, the minutia of this stuff, knowing how arbitration works, knowing how international signings work, all that stuff. Well, people who have lives and better jobs don't need to do that. Right. But what it does mean is the less you're willing to dig into this, and just the angrier you are, I suppose, or the more you benefit from riling up people who are already angry, which we don't really benefit from that because it's not the type of show we do. The easier it is to say, like, how can they trade a batting champ? Right. It's a lot easier to say, oh my God, this is the stupidest thing ever. What team would trade a 25-year-old batting champ than it is to go, well, he was 15th at his position and OPS and he's got bad knees and he blah, blah, blah. It's a lot easier to just go, oh, this trade must have been all about money than to go, no, actually they make it equal money and probably always will. It's a lot easier to go, well, yeah, Arraez's production is good but not great, but they're going to really miss those pitches he takes. Than it actually is to go, he doesn't actually take that many pitches. Right. You can just view it for what it is. So, I don't know. That's the type of stuff we try to provide. With that said, though, I mean, John just said, you just said, it's probably not a trade you would have done. I would say I'm kind of neutral on it. I think from a theoretical standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Trading a good bat for a good arm makes a lot of sense where the Twins are from a depth and talent standpoint. I think the prospects are a key part of this, whether they end up playing for the Twins or get traded in the meantime, whatever it is. But yeah, I don't know that Lopez is who I would have targeted necessarily.
And I'll say that I think they are going to. I think I would agree that they are going to have. They are going to be. It'll be easier for them to replace Arraez's offensive productivity than it would be for them to have replaced Lopez's pitching proficiency.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
That's a big part of this.
That's. I think if the Twins had 4 starters I really trusted and they were still out there searching for a 5th one, I might have felt different about it. The fact that they had 5 but I understand that I am probably underestimating the amount of risk associated with the injuries that are associated with that various starting pitchers.
I mean, clearly they made this move. I don't know. They would be happy if Lopez just continued to pitch as he has for the past 3 years, which has been, a 3.75 ERA or 3.52 ERA the past 3 years. Last year was like 3.75 or whatever. Mm-hmm. That would make him a, number 2/number 3 starter. That would make him a Sonny Gray-esque starter. That would possibly make him their best starter or their second best starter. That's all. They don't need more than that necessarily for this trade to make sense long term, for this trade to pay off for them. But I do think the Twins feel like he's, I don't want to say he's like a breakout candidate because he's already been pretty good. But I do think they believe there's one more kind of step up in class that he can make if he stays healthy, obviously, with a pitch tweak here, a pitch tweak there, an approach tweak here, approach tweak there. But they've said that in the past about guys, and sometimes they're right. With like Jay Odorizzi, they were right about. Joe Ryan, they were right about. But sometimes they're wrong. And also injuries can just make that a moot point in general, which he has an injury factor involved too. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to miss watching Luis Arraez, but I hope people can kind of compartmentalize that. That doesn't have to change. How much fun you had watching him and how much you enjoyed watching him doesn't have to change. You don't have to go back in time and erase that. You don't have to change your opinion of that. You can, at any point, flipping around TV, if the Marlins are on some game, seems unlikely, but if the Marlins are on your TV and you see Luis Arraez, you can, in your heart, think, damn, he was fun to watch. That doesn't have to change, but I hope people can compartmentalize that from what was his actual value, what was his actual upside, what was the likelihood over the next 3 years that he'll be, a all-star level player at a position where the bar for offense is pretty high.
Not just us, not just the people that listen to us, but Derek Falvey basically said the same thing. Basically said, I'm going to be rooting for Luis Arraez. Right. I love watching Luis Arraez play baseball. I'm going to be watching him even though he's on the Marlins. But obviously, when it came down to value and how he needed to, position the team, I'll say this. I'll throw this in there. This does leave them open to now go get a decent, a bigger offensive player if they want to pivot that direction.
That is, I think, the biggest remaining question is we talked about this with Phil Miller on the Patreon. Right. He thinks they're going to add a reliever still.
Right. Yes.
I think that would be smart. I don't necessarily know that they're going to do that. I think that would be very smart, especially if it's a righty. But beyond that, I still think they could use a right-handed hitting outfielder, but they seem less worried about that as a weakness. But this definitely,
I think we'll see that. By the way,
I mean, it could be one.
I don't think it'll be a significant outfielder. But I think
the guy you're talking about could also be the guy I don't think the guy. Like, there's one player, but the player type you're talking about, which is someone to replace Arraez at first base DH,
right,
could also be capable of playing left field,
could be.
And could be a right-handed bat. I mean, I don't want to say Robbie Grossman or something. I know people aren't big fans of his, but that type of player, Luke Voigt's only a first
he got
baseman.
on base. He would be a bad guy to be at the leadoff up there.
You just want to duplicate Luis Arraez's on base skills. So I think that's probably the biggest question. We're only 25 days from pitchers and catchers, right?
Yeah, something like that.
15. Yeah. So
something like that. Yeah.
As we talk about every year,
23.
The Twins stretch the offseason as far as possible, and they try to play musical chairs at the end, and they try to hope that there's a few places left without a chair. We're kind of at that point now. I mean, February there'll be some stuff still to do, but they're at just under $150 million for payroll. The remaining question of are they going to trade Kepler is still out there, which would clear another $8.5 million in payroll. Also would bring back something.
Right. Potentially
some of the holes that we've been talking about could be filled that way.
Easily could get a right-handed reliever for that.
You would think, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think this takes from a logjam, removes one kind of piece from that.
I'm not sure they'll trade Kepler now. I'm much less confident that they're going to trade Kepler. I was 100% sure they would trade Kepler, even if it was just for a prospect by the time spring training happened.
Here's the thing about that. Before they signed Joey Gallo, we thought they were going to trade Kepler.
Right.
So they signed Gallo as a left-handed bat, and then they removed Arraez from a left-handed bat. So aren't you just sort of back to where you started from a left-handed bat standpoint?
I'm not saying I'm sure they're going to trade. Not. I'm sure they're not going to trade Kepler. I think that's still in play. But I do think they like the idea of an outfield of Gallo, Buxton, Kepler defensively. I mean, they like that idea, and then Correa and Polanco up the middle, right? And then, potentially Kirilloff at first base. They'd like that. Now Miranda at third base is the glaring difference. Vasquez behind the plate. Right. And that 7 of your 8 spots there are pretty well taken care of.
Yeah, although now they might need Gallo at first base.
Well, they might. But
in which case you have Larnach or somebody else.
Maybe you've got Kirilloff at first base. We'll see.
Well, yeah, but he's not going to play 162 games at first base. I mean, he wasn't going to do that with he wasn't necessarily going to either.
But still, I feel pretty good about 120 other stuff. I would hate moving Gallo to first base. I don't want. I think he will, but I'd much rather see Gallo in the outfield.
Well, right, but the over/under on games played by Alex Kirilloff is probably about 50.
We'll see,
right?
We'll see, yeah.
There's going to have to be another first baseman. It could be Miranda, depending on who they want to play at third base. But okay. That's probably it.
Okay. So the plan this week, if you would like to join the Patreon, lots of lots of people have joined the Patreon. We're at, 3,700 people? 3,700 people agree.
It's worth checking.
Yeah, let's get us 4,000.
The 3,000 hit club, it's good. The 4,000 hit club, so much more impressive.
I think you're going to be paying about $1 a week up until spring training, and then you're going to be paying $2 a week. So that'll be okay. You'll be all right.
You get the full, you get access once you sign up. You get free access to the full archives, which is a couple hundred episodes, including, like we said, recent interviews with Dan Hayes, Phil Miller.
A lot more Pablo immediate reaction talk like we just did, right? And then you also get to ask questions for the mailbag, which we're probably going to be having on Wednesday. So,
thank you to our sponsor for this show, BetterHelp.
Yep.
Thank you to Luis Arraez, who was a lot of fun to watch.
He was.
A lot of fun to cover. Yep. We didn't actually talk much about this, but by all accounts, the Miami media is feeling the same way about losing Pablo Lopez, or even more so.
Yes.
In the 40 minutes we spent on the Zoom with Pablo Lopez, like
he's
super
an
smart guy.
Yeah.
And then I just heard from people saying like he's one of those guys who will sign every autograph, do every public appearance, do every charity thing. So let's see if he can pitch. All right, goodbye.
Gleeman